Have you ever given someone everything you had, your time, your loyalty, your best years, and watched them hand it back to you like it meant nothing? Stay with me,
I
because
know
what
this is hard,
Nicole
but you
did
need to
next,
see this.
nobody
What is
saw
it? It's
coming,
about what happened. I
including
can't.
her. The last contraction hit at 11:41 p.m., and Nicole Torres gripped the steel rail of the hospital bed with both hands and did not make a sound. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt the way she imagined falling from a great height would hurt, the kind of pain that reorganizes everything inside you, that rearranges your understanding of what your body is capable of surviving. But Nicole had learned early in life that the most important moments demanded silence. That screaming used energy you might need later. So she breathed through it and counted, and when the monitor showed the contraction easing, she exhaled slowly through her nose and looked toward the window. Daniel Lopez was standing at the window. He had been standing there for the better part of 2 hours. His navy vest was still pressed, still perfect, at 11:41 in the evening after 16 hours in this room, because Daniel was the kind of man who cared enormously about the appearance of things. His back was to her. His right hand held his phone at his side, and, even from the bed, Nicole could see the faint blue glow of the screen against his palm, pulsing intermittently in the dark, the rhythm of incoming messages, outgoing messages, a conversation happening somewhere else while his wife labored behind him. She knew who he was texting. She had known for 3 months. "Daniel?" Her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw from hours of controlled breathing. "Come see him." He turned. There was a moment she would think about this moment for a long time afterward, where his face did something honest, where the careful arrangement of his expression slipped, and she saw something underneath it that might have been fear or grief, or the particular shame of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and is doing it anyway. Then it rearranged itself. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of the bassinet where the nurse had just placed the baby, and he looked down. Noah Torres had been in the world for 6 minutes. He was small and red-faced and furious about it, with his mother's dark hair already damp against his scalp and his hands curled into fists the size of walnuts. The nurse had swaddled him tightly in the standard blue and white hospital blanket, and he was making the particular sound that newborns make, not quite crying, not quite breathing, something in between that sounds like the body learning itself for the first time. Daniel looked at his son for 3 seconds. Nicole counted. Then he stepped back and walked out of the room. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She listened to the monitor beside her, tracking her own heartbeat, steady and deliberate. She looked at Noah, who had stopped making sounds and was now simply existing with the focused intensity of something new to the world. And she felt the full weight of the evening settle into her chest, not as despair, but as a kind of cold clarity that she recognized. She had felt it once before, at 23, standing in a lawyer's office in Lower Manhattan, while a man in a gray suit explained that her father was gone and that everything he had built now belonged to her. The feeling of a life reorganizing itself around a new fact. 3 minutes after Daniel left, the door opened again. Sandra Anderson did not knock. She had never knocked on a door in her life if she could avoid it, because knocking implied that the person inside had some authority over whether you entered. And Sandra had long ago decided that she was not the kind of woman who deferred to other people's authority. She came into room 402 of St. Augustine Medical Center the way she came into every room, directly, without hesitation, with the full confidence of someone who had checked in advance to make sure the room would accommodate her. She was 64 years old and dressed as though she were attending a board meeting rather than the birth of her first grandchild. St. John knits in black, perfectly fitted. Hair the color of winter frost, swept back. Nails lacquered a dark arterial red. She wore no bag. She carried only a thick manila envelope, and she held it the way a surgeon holds an instrument, with purpose and without sentiment. She did not ask how Nicole was. She did not ask to hold the baby. She walked to the foot of the bed and placed the envelope across Nicole's legs, and Nicole felt the weight of it through the thin hospital blanket, heavy, the way legal documents are heavy, dense with consequence. "Sign it, Nicole." Sandra's voice was the kind of voice that had never learned to soften, because softening had never been necessary. "The paternity test is pending, but the separation agreement is not negotiable." Nicole looked at the envelope. She looked at Daniel, who had reappeared in the doorway and was now leaning against the frame, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes directed at a point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance, the posture of a man who has decided that if he doesn't fully witness something, he isn't fully responsible for it. She looked back at Sandra, and in that moment, with 16 hours of labor still vibrating through her bones, and her son, 6 minutes old, in the bassinet beside her, Nicole felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion or pain. It was the feeling of a decision being made, not by her, by them, and the recognition that she had been waiting for this somewhere beneath the surface of the last 3 months, since the night she found Daniel's phone unlocked on the kitchen counter and read the message thread she wasn't supposed to see. She reached for the envelope. She did not open it yet. "Before you continue," Nicole said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her, the automated valuation model that Daniel pitched to Prescott Logistics last month, the one that cut their property assessment timeline from 3 weeks to 4 days. "Who do you think built that?" Sandra's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "The risk-scoring algorithm your CFO presented at the Portland Real Estate Summit in March. The one that got you 2 standing ovations and a feature in Pacific Business Journal. Who wrote the underlying code?" The room was very quiet. The monitor beeped. Noah made a small sound. "I spent 18 months building the technical infrastructure that made your company look like it belonged in this century," Nicole said. "Daniel didn't know what a weighted average cost of capital was when I met him. I sat with him at our kitchen table for 6 weeks until he could explain it without notes. The Prescott pitch deck, the one your PR team called a breakthrough, I designed the data visualization framework from scratch. I did it because I believed we were building something together." Sandra had recovered by then. Her expression had returned to its default setting, the particular blankness of someone who has heard many things and processed them primarily as obstacles or assets. "And you were compensated accordingly," she said. "A home, stability, the Whitmore name, and everything that comes with it." "I never took the Whitmore name," Nicole said. "It was a small thing." Sandra's eyes moved to the envelope, and Nicole could see the precise moment the implication registered. The signature on that document would read Nicole Torres, not Nicole Lopez, because Nicole had never legally changed her name after the wedding, a decision she had made for reasons she had never fully articulated even to herself, as though some part of her had always known she might need to remain intact. Sandra absorbed this and moved past it because Sandra Anderson did not linger on information that didn't immediately serve her. She laid out the situation with the brisk economy of someone reading a project summary. "Whitmore Property Group was $38 million underwater with First National Capital, which had extended its patience 3 times and was now done extending it. The merger with Prescott Logistics, specifically the arrangement whereby Daniel would marry George White's daughter Ashley, was the only viable exit from a debt structure that would otherwise take the company down within the fiscal year. George White had been clear about his terms. The merger was contingent on Daniel being unencumbered. "We'll give you $15,000, Sandra said. "More than enough to start over somewhere, away from Portland." Nicole looked at her for a long moment. "And Noah? Once the paternity test comes back negative, the question is moot." "And if it doesn't come back negative?" Sandra met her gaze without blinking. "Then we'll make appropriate arrangements to ensure the child is provided for, quietly, at a distance from the family." The child. In the bassinet, 6 inches from Nicole's right hand, Noah Torres was beginning to fall asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the concentrated effort of someone new to the business of breathing. His hands had uncurled slightly. His face had relaxed from its initial indignation into something softer, something that was already unmistakably a face, not just a newborn's generic face, but a specific person's face, with her father's jaw and her grandfather's forehead, and some quality around the eyes that Nicole couldn't yet name but recognized. She looked at Daniel. He was still in the doorway. And because she had decided in the last 3 minutes that if there were going to be any truth spoken in this room tonight, she was going to be the one to speak them, she said, "I found the text, Daniel, 3 months ago, the one you sent Ashley, saying the situation would be resolved before the wedding." The room went very still. "You knew about this plan while I was still in my 2nd trimester. You held my hand at the 20-week ultrasound, and you already knew. You let me believe we were building something together while you were already planning the exit." Daniel did not deny it. He looked at the floor. His jaw worked briefly silently, like a man rehearsing words he couldn't quite commit to. This was the thing about Daniel Lopez that Nicole had taken too long to understand. He was not cruel. Cruelty required a kind of conviction that Daniel did not possess. He was simply a man who had never been asked to choose between what was easy and what was right, because Sandra had always arranged things so that the easy choice and the right choice appeared to be the same thing, and on the one occasion in his adult life when they were clearly not the same thing, he was discovering that he had no muscles for the harder option. He had never built them. Noah made a sound. Not a cry, something smaller, a murmur of adjustment, the sound of a body settling into sleep. Daniel's eyes moved to the bassinet, and for a moment, a single unguarded moment, his face did the honest thing again. The mask came down, and underneath it was a man looking at his son for the first time, with the full knowledge that his son was his son, and whatever calculation he had been running in the back of his mind for the last 16 hours was now complicated by the undeniable reality of this specific small person existing in the world. He opened his mouth. Sandra placed her hand on his shoulder. "Daniel, we talked about this." He closed his mouth. He looked at the floor again. He chose for the 2nd time that evening the option that required nothing of him. Nicole watched this happen. She filed it carefully. She reached for the manila envelope. The separation agreement was 17 pages, single-spaced, with attachments. Nicole read it the way she read every legal document, completely in sequence, noting the specific language of each clause. Sandra stood at the foot of the bed with the particular impatience of a woman unaccustomed to being made to wait. But Nicole did not hurry. This was not stubbornness. This was information gathering. What she found by the end of page 4 was significant. Sandra had presented a separation agreement under Oregon revised statutes, not a divorce petition. This was a deliberate choice because Oregon required a minimum 90-day waiting period before a divorce petition could be finalized, which meant Sandra could not force a completed divorce tonight, regardless of what Nicole signed. The separation agreement was a preliminary instrument. It established temporary terms around property and custody, pending a full hearing, and it was designed to function as a first domino. Get Nicole's signature. Tonight, establish a paper trail of Nicole's apparent acceptance of Sandra's terms. Use that as leverage in the actual proceedings to come. It was well drafted. It was also not the trap Sandra thought it was. Nicole turned to the signature page. The line waited blank and expectant. She picked up the pen Sandra had placed on the blanket beside the envelope, a heavy silver pen, the kind bought to make signing feel significant, and she signed her name in full, clearly, with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Nicole Torres. "There," she said. She handed the signed agreement back to Sandra. "Now get out." Sandra took the papers with something that looked briefly like satisfaction. It would not last. "We'll be arranging for the paternity test first thing in the morning," Sandra said. "The hospital will coordinate." "The hospital will coordinate what I authorize them to coordinate," Nicole said. "You have your signed agreement. You have your separation. The custody determination is contingent on the test results as your own document specifies. Until that determination is made, Noah stays with me. Those are the terms you wrote. Get out of my room." Sandra looked at her for a moment, a long, assessing look, the kind she probably directed at contractors who were trying to renegotiate, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite uncertainty. Sandra Anderson did not do uncertainty, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like the first faint recalibration of an assumption she had been sure about. She turned and walked to the door. Daniel moved aside to let her pass, and for a moment he and Nicole were looking directly at each other across the length of the room with Noah sleeping between them. "I'm sorry, Nicole," he said. It came out quiet without structure, the kind of apology that knows it isn't sufficient, but offers itself anyway because silence is worse. "Save it," Nicole said. "Not with heat, just with finality, the way you close a door on a room you're not going back into." He followed his mother into the corridor. The door clicked shut. Nicole waited. She counted to 10, a habit she had developed at 23 in the lawyer's office, because she had learned that grief and clarity cannot occupy exactly the same moment, and that the first 10 seconds after a devastating thing are owned by grief, and the 11th second can belong to you if you take it. On 11 she moved. She reached into the diaper bag hanging on the hook beside the bed, the one she had packed herself 3 weeks ago with the thoroughness of someone who plans for contingencies, and she pushed past the diapers and the extra onesies and the small stuffed animal Carol had insisted on including, and she found the inner lining she had sewn herself from a piece of waterproof fabric, and inside it was a phone. It was a satellite-enabled encrypted device about the size and weight of a standard smartphone, but built to different specifications with a battery life measured in days rather than hours, and a signal capacity that didn't depend on local towers. Nicole had carried it for 2 years, sewn into whatever bag she was using, the way some people carry a spare key, because she was the kind of person who understood that circumstances could change without warning, and that preparation was not paranoia, it was respect for reality. She dialed from memory. It rang once. "This is Kenneth." Kenneth Lee's voice was the same at midnight as it was at 9 in the morning, precise, unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who has spent 20 years being the person other people called when things went wrong, and who has therefore made a kind of peace with being called. He was 48 years old and had been the chief operating officer of Torres Global Industries for 11 of those years, having been brought in originally by Harrison Torres as a junior counsel, and having stayed because he was, as Harrison had once put it, the rarest kind of person, one who understood both the architecture of systems and the nature of people who break them. "Kenneth," Nicole kept her voice low and level, though the room was empty. "Code Phoenix, the Anderson family just declared war." A pause. The sound of him moving of a chair, of something being opened. "GPS confirmed. St. Augustine's. Congratulations on Noah." Another pause, shorter. "How bad?" "They handed me a separation agreement in the recovery room. $15,000 to disappear." The exhale on the other end of the line was not dramatic. It was the sound of a man processing information and arriving at its implications efficiently. 15,000. That wouldn't cover Noah's first month of pediatric care. And they're standing in a hospital we've owned since 2019. "They think they own it," Nicole said. "Pull the full Whitmore financial structure. Everything public filings, shadow accounts, the First National Capital exposure. And Kenneth." She paused, looking at Noah, who slept through all of it with the magnificent indifference of someone who has just been born and has not yet learned to be afraid of anything. "Bring the navigator, the real plates. I'm done being invisible." "Understood. 20 minutes." She ended the call and set the phone on the blanket beside her. What nobody in that hospital room knew, not Sandra with her separation agreement, not Daniel with his careful blankness, not the nurses who had spent the last 16 hours watching a woman in labor without knowing anything real about her, was that Nicole Torres had not always been a barista. She had chosen to become one. Harrison Torres had come to the United States from nothing, in the specific American sense of nothing. That means a rented room in a city where you know no one and a skill set that the country you're in doesn't yet have a category for. He had built Torres Global across 30 years through the kind of disciplined, relentless, frequently lonely work that doesn't make for good storytelling because it lacks dramatic peaks. It is simply the accumulation of correct decisions made consistently, day after day, in the face of significant pressure to make easier ones instead. By the time Nicole was 10 years old, the company was worth $400 million. By the time she was 20, it was worth considerably more. He had never let her forget that money was a tool, not a destination. He had also never let her forget what money did to people, specifically what it did to the way people looked at you when they knew you had it. "I have watched men who wanted to be my friend," he told her once when she was 16 and furious about something she couldn't now remember, and men who wanted to be near my money. The difference is not always obvious at first, but it becomes obvious, and then you cannot unknow it. He had watched this happen to himself for 30 years. He did not want it to happen to her. He died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday in October, when Nicole was 23 years old and the world contracted to a single point of grief that she was still 6 years later occasionally surprised by. She had inherited everything, $2.3 billion at the time of the estate settlement, managed through a trust structure that Harrison had spent a decade constructing for exactly this eventuality with Kenneth Lee as the trustee's designated advisor, and the instruction written in her father's precise hand in the letter he had left for her that she should take whatever time she needed before deciding what she wanted to do with it. She had taken 2 years. She had gone to Portland under her mother's maiden name, Nicole Warren, and found a job at a coffee shop near the Pearl District, and she had lived in a one-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture and a view of someone else's fire escape, and she had made pour-overs and flat whites and learned the names of the regulars and discovered with some surprise that she was good at the quiet rhythms of ordinary life, that she liked them, that the person she was when no one knew her name was someone she was interested in being. She had met Daniel Lopez 8 months into this experiment. He had come in on a rainy Wednesday in November and ordered an Americano and left a reasonable tip and came back the next day and the day after that, and over the course of 3 months of daily Americanos had graduated to asking her name, and then to asking if she wanted to get dinner, and then to being someone she thought about when he wasn't there. He was charming in a low-key, slightly awkward way that she found genuine. He worked in his family's real estate business with what seemed like honest ambivalence. He was not entirely comfortable with the world he had grown up in, or at least he performed that discomfort convincingly. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He laughed at things she said. She had believed him. That was the thing she could not quite let go of, even now. Even in the wreckage of this night, she had believed him not because she was naive, but because she had been careful, and because the belief had seemed for a time well-founded. The first sign had been small enough to explain away a particular tightness in his manner on certain evenings that she attributed to stress at work, the way he sometimes checked his phone with an urgency he did not account for. She had noticed these things and filed them under the category of things she did not yet have enough information about, because Nicole did not make accusations without evidence. She waited. The evidence came on a Tuesday evening in early spring when Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he hot showered and the screen had lit with a message from a contact saved as A.T. Initials she recognized because she had met Ashley Thomas exactly once at a Whitmore Company dinner and had formed the impression of a woman whose cheerfulness was architectural constructed to serve a specific function. The message read, "Told Dad you're handling the situation. He wants confirmation by end of quarter. You good?" She had read it once. Put the phone back down. Finished making dinner. She had spent the next 3 months gathering information the way she had been taught to gather it systematically, without emotion contaminating the process, building a complete picture before drawing any conclusions. She had accessed the Whitmore financial records through channels that were not technically available to anyone outside the company's board, but which were available to her because she was Nicole Torres, and the right channels were always available to her if she knew where to look. She had found the debt structure, the first national exposure, the preliminary merger discussions with Prescott Logistics. She had found the term sheet that George White had sent to Sandra in February with its marriage requirement, spelled out in the second paragraph. She had stayed. She had stayed because she was 7 months pregnant, and because leaving required a kind of certainty she was still constructing, and because there was a part of her, smaller than she wanted to admit, that kept waiting for Daniel to prove the evidence wrong. To come to her one evening and say something true, to choose something other than what she increasingly understood he had already chosen. He had not. And so here they were. Carol Lee appeared in the doorway of room 402 approximately 4 minutes after Sandra and Daniel had left it. She was 58 years old, compact and deliberate in her movements, with gray threading through dark hair she kept cut short and practical. She had worked for the Torres family for 15 years, brought in originally when Nicole's mother was ill and in need of consistent professional care, and had stayed after both Harrison and his wife were gone, because the Torres household was the closest thing to home she had constructed in the adult portion of her life. She carried a bag that Nicole recognized as the one she had packed for her, the real one, the one she had handed Carol for safekeeping before she checked in. She looked at Nicole across the room with the expression of someone who has been waiting without surprise. "I heard some of it," Carol said, not an apology, just an acknowledgement. "I expected you would," Nicole said. Carol crossed the room and set the bag in the chair beside the bed and looked at Noah with the attentiveness of someone taking a full inventory. "He's well," she said. Not a question. "He's well," Nicole confirmed. 15 years earlier, when Carol's husband died of a stroke and left her with a mortgage she could not service and a grief she could not yet navigate, Harrison Torres had paid off the remaining balance of her home loan without being asked, and without making it an occasion for anything. He had simply learned of the situation through a mutual acquaintance, and had the funds transferred and sent Carol a brief note, saying that he hoped the reduced pressure would give her time to find her footing. He had never mentioned it again. Carol had never forgotten it. She was here tonight in room 402 of a hospital, where she had no business being, because the debt she carried was not financial, but the other kind, the kind that doesn't expire, and because some obligations you honor not because you're required to, but because the alternative is to be the kind of person who doesn't. Nicole reached for the satellite phone again. She had been thinking while Carol settled Noah and the fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor bled under the door about a specific line in the Whitmore financial records she had reviewed 6 weeks ago. A funding source she had not initially focused on because it had seemed peripheral, a capital injection vehicle for the Prescott merger labeled Meridian Bridge Capital in the preliminary term sheet, with its partnership structure not publicly disclosed. She had not pulled the partnership structure at the time. She was pulling it now in her head from the full database access she had arranged remotely on a tablet she kept at the Torres apartment. The access Kenneth had confirmed was still live. "Kenneth," she said when he picked up, "while you're pulling the Whitmore file, find me the full partnership structure for Meridian Bridge Capital, the fund financing the Prescott merger." "Already running." 40 seconds of silence. "Nicole." His voice had changed register slightly, not alarmed, but with the particular quality of someone who has found something that changes the shape of things. Meridian Bridge Capital Partnership Structure. Limited partners of record include Torres Private Equity Fund, 348% controlling interest. The room was very quiet. Nicole processed this for 10 seconds, which was 9 seconds longer than it required. Torres Private Equity Fund 3 was one of 14 investment vehicles she controlled through the Torres Trust. It had been deployed 18 months ago into a portfolio of bridge financing instruments across the Pacific Northwest, a relatively routine allocation that she had reviewed and approved in a quarterly meeting and, subsequently, not thought about specifically. She had not known at the time that one of those instruments would eventually fund the lifeline of the family, that was currently trying to erase her. She was financing their escape from a debt that they had offered her $15,000 to disappear from. They were borrowing her money to replace her. The sound that came out of Nicole Torres in the fluorescent quiet of room 402 was not quite a laugh, though it had some of the qualities of one. It was the sound of irony arriving at such perfect pitch that the only appropriate response is a kind of helpless, cold recognition. "Freeze the capital injection," she said. "Full hold on the Meridian Bridge, funding for the Whitmore-Prescott merger. Compliance review, effective as of 11:59 tonight." "That kills their payroll by Friday morning." "I know. The merger timeline will not survive the week." She paused. "And, Kenneth, I need everything on a broker named Timothy Clark. Irongate Capital Partners, Portland office. He specializes in distressed debt acquisition. I want to know his terms for Sandra Anderson does. Tonight, if possible. I'll have a full profile within the hour. Take us to the Torres apartment on Park First. Noah needs a proper environment, and Carol needs a kitchen." She looked at her son, who was still sleeping, with the concentrated serenity of someone who had no idea that the world he had entered 6 minutes ago was already mid-reorganization in his favor. "And, Kenneth, the real plates. I meant it." "Understood. 15 minutes. Service entrance." She ended the call and lay back against the pillows for the first time since Sandra had walked in and let herself feel briefly and completely the weight of the evening. Not just Sandra's visit or Daniel's silence or the separation agreement still lying on the blanket beside her leg. The whole of it, 2 years of a life she had built under false pretenses, trying to find something true. And the particular grief of discovering that what you had built was built partly on someone else's lie. She had not been naive. She had been hopeful. There was a difference, and it mattered, and she was not going to lose sight of it. She let herself have 30 seconds of that feeling. Then she sat up, folded the separation agreement into thirds, and placed it in the inside pocket of the bag Carol had set beside her. Across the city, in the dining room of the Whitmore estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, crystal glasses were meeting each other over the sound of a chandelier burning at full brightness. Sandra Anderson was seated at the head of a table long enough to hold 12, with Daniel on her right and Ashley Thomas on his right, and the atmosphere in the room was celebratory, in the way that rooms are celebratory when people are celebrating something that requires a certain willed momentum to sustain. Ashley held her champagne flute with both hands, rotating it slightly. "I still can't believe she just signed." She had a quality of relentless brightness that Nicole had observed at the one Whitmore dinner she had attended, a brightness that operated independently of whatever was actually happening in the room. "I thought for sure she'd make a scene, make it complicated." "That type of woman always has a price," Sandra said, cutting into her steak with a precision that was almost surgical. $15,000, and she practically ran. It tells you everything you need to know." Ashley laughed and looked at Daniel. "Right, Ricky. Weren't you worried she'd fight?" Daniel set his fork down, slowly, with a deliberateness that Ashley did not notice, and Sandra noticed entirely. "His name is Noah," he said. The table went quiet. Not dramatically, just a brief interruption in the conversational current, the way a room goes slightly still when someone has said something slightly off script. Ashley glanced at Sandra. Sandra did not look at her. She was looking at Daniel with an expression that was not quite warning, but was certainly attention. "Daniel," she said the word, a container for many other words. He looked at his plate. "Nothing," he said. "Forget it." He reached for his wine. Sandra's phone face up on the table beside her bread plate. She kept her phone visible during meals in the way that generals keep their communications equipment close during operations, lit up with a priority notification. She picked it up with the practiced motion of someone who had been navigating crises by phone for 4 decades. She read the subject line. The change in her face was not dramatic. Sandra Anderson had spent 64 years learning to control what her face communicated, and she was very good at it. But Nicole, had she been watching, would have recognized what happened in the next 3 seconds, the brief arrest of motion, the quality of attention shifting from the room to the interior, the particular stillness of someone whose model of reality has just been complicated by a fact that doesn't fit it. Urgent. Meridian Bridge. Capital. Injection hold. File WH-2024-09. Compliance review initiated. Estimated resolution timeline. Indefinite pending review completion. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Sandra opened the full email, read it, read it again, set the phone down on the tablecloth with a care that was entirely at odds with the expression she was controlling. "The Meridian Bridge funding," she said, her voice reduced to something closer to a murmur than she intended. "It's been frozen. Compliance hold." The word frozen crossed the table and landed in Daniel's chest like something thrown hard. What does that mean for Friday? He was already calculating payroll, bridge loan covenants, the term sheet clause requiring proof of funds before George White would authorize his signature. What does it mean for the merger timeline? Sandra did not answer immediately. She was doing her own calculations, and they were not producing results she wanted to share. "It's a glitch," she said, finally, with a conviction she did not have. "A compliance flag. We'll have it resolved by morning." Ashley looked between them. Resolved by morning, meaning the money is still coming because Dad is expecting confirmation by... "It will be resolved," Sandra said. She picked up her wine glass, set it back down without drinking, picked up her phone and dialed a number from her contacts, Carlton Webb at Meridian Bridge, a man she had spent 6 months building a relationship with, whose fondness for Scotch she had leveraged, and whose professional ambitions she had quietly supported. The call went directly to voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail. She set the phone down. Across the city, or rather across 2 cities, because Nicole was already in the Navigator moving through Portland's late-night streets, with Noah and Carol in the back, and Kenneth at the wheel, providing a financial briefing in the quiet, comprehensive way he provided all briefings, as though the information were a landscape he was guiding her through. The first move had been made. Kenneth handed her a tablet across the center console. The Whitmore financial structure was laid out in full, the $38.4 million exposure, the revolving credit lines, the First National capital terms, and now the frozen Meridian Bridge funding its hold, confirmed at 11:59 p.m. Portland time. She scrolled through it with the speed of someone for whom financial documents are a native language rather than a foreign one, her eyes moving down the columns of figures with the efficiency of a reader who knows exactly what she's looking for and recognizes it when she finds it. "Timothy Clark," Kenneth said, "Irongate Capital Partners. He's a broker for distressed debt, primarily small to mid-cap real estate companies in financial difficulty. His standard model extend a lifeline at punishing interest rates with the company's real property as collateral, then acquire the property when the borrower defaults. He's done this successfully 14 times in the last 8 years. His price for a buyout? He'll want a significant premium to transfer contract rights before signature, but he's motivated by cash, not loyalty. If the offer is right, he'll take it. Nicole handed the tablet back. She looked out the window at Portland, moving past the Pearl District, giving way to the Morrison Bridge. The bridge giving way to the east side, the city doing what cities do at midnight, which is to say continuing regardless of what any individual within it is experiencing. She had always liked this about cities. The indifference was almost comforting. Whatever had happened in room 402 tonight, the city had not reorganized itself around it. The reorganization was hers to do. "Set a meeting with Clark for tomorrow morning," she said. "My schedule, not his. And Kenneth, I need the full background on Cascadia Debt Partners. I've seen the name in secondary searches before, and I want to understand what it is." "I'll have it ready." The navigator moved quietly through the streets. In the back seat, Carol had Noah against her chest and was not speaking, which was one of the things Nicole had always valued about Carol. She understood the difference between silence that was absence and silence that was presence. Noah was making small sounds, the sounds of a person adjusting to a world that was, despite everything, going to be adequate. The Torres apartment on Park Avenue was on the 41st floor of a building that had been in the Torres Trust since 1998, acquired by Harrison for reasons that were partly practical and partly sentimental. His first office in New York had been across the street in a building that no longer existed. The apartment itself was not large by the standards of what Nicole could have chosen, but it was complete. The right light in the morning, a kitchen that functioned, walls that held the warmth of a place that had been genuinely lived in at various points across a quarter century. Carol took Noah to the room that had already been prepared. Kenneth had called ahead, as Kenneth always did. And Nicole stood in the kitchen and set her phone on the counter and stood in the quiet for a moment that was not rest exactly, but something adjacent to it. The kind of stillness that comes after great effort, when the body knows it has more effort ahead and is taking what it can before the next requirement arrives. She walked to the window. 41st floor midnight, the city laid out below her in its comprehensive illumination, every light a person, every person a story, the aggregate of it, something vast and indifferent, and if you had the right angle on it, beautiful. Her phone lit up on the counter. Kenneth Meridian Bridge hold confirmed. Whitmore payroll exposure, Friday, 9 a.m. First National Capital Bridge Loan Covenant triggered at 5 p.m. Friday, if no resolution. She read it once, set the phone back down. She walked to the room where Noah was sleeping in the travel bassinet Carol had assembled with practiced efficiency, and she stood in the doorway and looked at him in the low yellow light Carol had arranged to approximate the warmth of something domestic and safe. He was very small. He would not be very small for long. That was one of the things about babies that people told you and that you could not fully understand until you were standing in a doorway at midnight looking at one. The knowledge that this specific smallness was temporary, that the person in front of you was already in the process of becoming something else, something larger and more defined, and that the window in which they were precisely this was closing even now. She thought about what her father had said about the people who had known him, the ones who had seen money where he was standing. She thought about Daniel in the doorway of room 402, looking at his son for 3 seconds before he chose the floor instead. She thought about Sandra's face when she read the Meridian notification and the calculation that was already underway behind those careful eyes and where that calculation would lead. She thought about Timothy Clark and his 14 successful acquisitions and what he would say when she told him what she was offering and why. She thought about the separation agreement in her bag, signed in her name, and what it had actually transferred and what it had not. "You will never know what that room felt like tonight," she said very quietly to the small person sleeping in the yellow light, "because I'm going to make sure the people who put us there can't reach us again." Noah slept on, unbothered. Down the hall she heard Kenneth come in through the service entrance with the discretion of long practice. She heard him settle at the dining room table with his laptop and his phone, beginning the work that would continue through the night, and that would by morning have produced the foundation of what came next. Sandra Anderson thought she had discarded a barista. She had no idea that the woman she'd handed that envelope to could, if she chose, buy the building they were standing in before breakfast. She had no idea that the compliance hold on the Meridian Bridge funding was not a glitch, but a decision. She had no idea that the separation agreement she had carried into room 402 as a weapon had been signed by someone who had read it more carefully than Sandra's own lawyers had, and who had found in its careful language exactly the room she needed. The city continued below the window, indifferent and vast, and lit up in every direction. Nicole Torres went to bed. Tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. Tonight, she had a son who was 4 hours old and a city full of people who didn't know her name. That was for now enough. 6 o'clock in the morning came into the Torres apartment the way it came into all east-facing rooms in New York, not gradually, but as a fact. The light arrived through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 41st floor with the blunt authority of something that had traveled a very long distance and was not interested in being subtle about its arrival. Nicole was already awake. She had been awake since 5, sitting at the dining room table with Kenneth's overnight research spread across the surface in the organized way that Kenneth organized everything primary documents in the center, supporting materials to the left, action items to the right, a system so consistent that Nicole could navigate it in the dark. She was not in the dark, she was dressed. The suit was Donna Karan cream wool, cut close through the shoulders and straight through the leg, a garment she had not worn in 2 years because the life she had been living did not have occasions for it. The fabric had a particular quality of authority that was not about expense, though it was expensive, but about construction, the way it held its shape, regardless of what the person inside it was doing, which was a quality Nicole had always admired in clothing as in people. Her hair was back simply. The only jewelry she wore was the thin gold bangle on her left wrist, worn smooth in places from years of contact with the edge of keyboards and desk surfaces, a habit of her mother's that Nicole had adopted without consciously deciding to. She had made coffee in the kitchen while Noah slept, and Carol dozed in the chair beside his bassinet, and she had drunk it standing at the counter reviewing Kenneth's Timothy Clark profile. And by the time the light came through the windows, she had made 3 decisions and was ready to act on all of them. Kenneth emerged from the second bedroom at 6:12, already dressed, carrying his laptop and the particular focused energy of a man who had slept 4 hours by choice, because 4 hours was sufficient, and there was work to do. He looked at her across the kitchen and took in the suit and the set of her expression, and said nothing, which was correct, because there was nothing to say about it that wasn't already evident. "The Andersons have been calling Meridian since 5:45, he said, setting the laptop on the counter. "Carlton Webb's voicemail is full. Sandra has now moved to secondary contacts at the fund. She reached a junior associate at 6:03, who told her the review was initiated at the compliance level and he didn't have authorization to discuss the timeline." Nicole wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "She's already pivoting. Irongate Capital Partners, Timothy Clark. I confirmed he has a standing arrangement with 2 other Portland developers currently in distress. He keeps his pipeline active. He'll take Sandra's call when it comes, probably before 10. "Then I need to see him before 10. She set the cup down. "Set the meeting at the Torres Global offices on Morrison, not at Irongate. And Kenneth, I run this conversation myself. You're in the room, but I close it." He nodded once, opened his laptop, and began making the call. This was the thing she had been thinking about since the early hours of the morning, when she had lain awake in the bedroom with the city doing its nighttime business 41 floors below, and her mind doing its own business regardless of the hour. She had spent 2 years allowing other people to arrange things on her behalf, Kenneth managing the Torres Global operations remotely, while she lived her barista life, a structure that had served her well enough, but had also, she recognized, now created a kind of comfortable passivity in her. She had been the person who approved decisions rather than the person who made them in real time, because the life she had been living did not require real-time decision-making in the same way. That life was over as of 11:47 last night. She was, as of this morning, the person who made things happen. Kenneth was the person who made sure the infrastructure existed for her to do that. The distinction mattered, and she was going to hold it. Timothy Clark's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Morrison Street that had the slightly deflated quality of commercial real estate that had once aspired to something grander and had settled into adequacy. Clark himself appeared in the Torres Global conference room at 8:47, 12 minutes after the scheduled time, wearing a suit that was good enough to suggest he understood the importance of appearances without being good enough to suggest he actually understood them. He had the kind of face that was always slightly more alert than his posture suggested, the face of a man who had learned to look relaxed as a professional technique. He looked around the Torres Global conference room, the clean lines of it, the view of the Morrison Bridge, the particular quality of a space where the furniture and the silence both cost money, and his alertness increased by a measurable degree. Nicole was already seated. She did not stand when he came in. "Ms. Torres?" He settled across from her with the careful ease of a man trying to establish parity. "I have to say, when your office called this morning, I wasn't expecting Mr. Clark." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to tell you exactly what I want, and then I'm going to make you an offer, and the offer will be good for this meeting only. It won't be on the table when you walk out of this room. I suggest you listen carefully." He listened. She told him she wanted a preemptive assignment of contract rights, meaning that whatever Whitmore Properties signed with Irongate today, she wanted those rights transferred to a Torres private equity vehicle before the ink dried. She would pay double Irongate's standard interest rate for the immediate buyout. Cash transfer within the hour of signature. Her name would not appear on the paperwork. The acquiring vehicle would be listed as Pacific Bridge Holdings, a Torres subsidiary with no public connection to Torres Global. Clark was quiet for a moment. He was doing the math, which was straightforward, and then he was doing the other kind of math, the calculation of what it meant that Nicole Torres was sitting across from him at 8:47 in the morning, 12 hours after delivering a baby, to arrange the acquisition of her mother-in-law's emergency loan before her mother-in-law had made the call. He was a man who had spent 20 years in the distressed debt space, which meant he was a man who had spent 20 years understanding that information and timing were the only assets that actually mattered. He understood what he was looking at. "Ms. Torres," he said, and the careful easiness had shifted into something more straightforward. The register of a man who has decided to stop performing and engage with the actual situation. "It's a pleasure to do business with you." "Don't call it a pleasure until the transfer is confirmed," Nicole said. "I'll send Kenneth the wire details." She stood. He stood. They did not shake hands. She was back at the Torres apartment by 10:15. Noah was awake, working through a bottle that Carol was managing with practiced efficiency while making sounds of quiet encouragement, and Nicole sat on the floor beside the bassinet for 20 minutes, doing nothing except being present with her son in the way that the morning had not yet allowed. He looked at her with the unfocused intensity of someone whose visual system was still calibrating, tracking the sound of her voice, without yet being able to locate its source with precision. She talked to him not about anything significant, just the ordinary running commentary of a parent, narrating the immediate world to someone new to it, and felt for those 20 minutes the specific quality of calm that comes from occupying only the present moment. Kenneth came to the doorway at 10:42. Sandra called Clark. Nicole looked up. "He took the meeting. 2:00 Irongate offices." She nodded. She looked at Noah, who had finished the bottle and was now conducting a serious examination of his own hand. The hand was objectively extraordinary to him. She understood the feeling. "Let me know when she signs," she said. Sandra Anderson arrived at the Irongate Capital Partners offices on Southwest 5th Avenue at 1:58, which was 2 minutes early. Because Sandra was always exactly 2 minutes early to meetings, she needed "not on time," which communicated equivalence, and "not late," which communicated disrespect, but 2 minutes early, which communicated that she had arranged her day around this and expected it to be taken seriously. She had dressed carefully, charcoal gray suit, pearl earrings, the bearing of a woman who is in difficulty but refuses to let the difficulty define her posture. Clark was waiting for her. He had the loan documents already prepared, which she noted and which she chose to interpret as efficiency rather than prearrangement. The terms were aggressive. $12 million at 17%, with the Whitmore estate in Greenwich as primary collateral and the Portland commercial properties as secondary. She read through the document with the thoroughness of someone who had been reading contracts for 4 decades, and she found the terms punishing but survivable. Survivable meaning that if the Meridian hold was resolved within the week, she could refinance at a reasonable rate and have the Irongate obligation retired before it compounded significantly. She signed on the 6th page, her signature firm and her expression controlled. She felt in the car afterward something she was careful not to call relief, because relief was premature. She felt the reduction of immediate pressure, which was a different thing. The $12 million would hit the Whitmore operating account by 4:00. She would make payroll Friday. The Prescott merger was damaged, but not dead. George White was a pragmatic man who understood that cash flow interruptions happened, and if she could demonstrate solvency by end of week, she could salvage the timeline. She was 3 blocks from the Iron Gate building when her phone rang. It was Richard, her CFO, and his voice had the quality of a man who has just looked at something he was not prepared to look at. "Sandra, the account." "What about the account? The $12 million came in." A pause that lasted too long. And then it was gone. Sandra's driver, sensing something, kept his eyes on the road. "What do you mean, gone?" "Garnishment notice. Came through 2 minutes after the Iron Gate transfer cleared. Pacific Bridge Holdings, they've acquired the First National Capital debt. The garnishment is a standard collection action under the debt purchase agreement." Another pause. Sandra Pacific Bridge Holdings filed the debt acquisition with First National 3 days ago. They had the paperwork ready before you walked into Iron Gate. The car moved through Portland traffic. Sandra sat very still. She was running the logic backward, the way you do when you realize you've been navigating a maze and have just discovered that someone else built it. The Meridian Hold, the First National Debt Acquisition, Pacific Bridge Holdings, the timing 3 days ago, which meant while she was still celebrating at the dinner table, while she was watching Daniel fail to finish his wine, while the separation agreement was still in its envelope, someone had already purchased the instrument that would neutralize whatever she did next. Someone who had known 3 days ago what she was going to do. "Richard," she said, her voice at a register she rarely used, the one that came out when she had stripped away everything that wasn't essential and was speaking from the functional core. "Find out who owns Pacific Bridge Holdings." The silence on his end told her he had already looked. "It's a Torres subsidiary," he said. "Torres Private Equity." She heard it. She let it settle. She recognized the name the way you recognize a name that you know from a specific context, the context in which Torres Global Industries was the largest privately held technology and energy conglomerate on the eastern seaboard, the context in which Harrison Torres had died 6 years ago and left his company to his daughter, the context in which his daughter's name, as it happened, appeared on a separation agreement that Sandra had handed to a woman in a hospital bed 12 hours ago. Nicole Torres, not Nicole Lopez, not Nicole Whitmore. Nicole Torres. The car pulled to a stop at a light, and Sandra Anderson sat in the back of it with her phone against her ear and felt the architecture of everything she had constructed over the past 3 months. The careful negotiations with George White, the quiet arrangement with Ashley, the particular timing of the separation agreement, all of it began to describe the outline of a structure built on a fact she had not known, which was that the woman she had discarded was the inheritor of a fortune that made the Whitmore debt look like a rounding error. She had thrown a $15,000 envelope at a billionaire. In her former dining room at the Whitmore estate in Greenwich, Daniel Lopez received the paternity test results at 7:49 that evening. He had ordered the expedited processing himself through a lab that Sandra did not control because he had decided quietly without announcing the decision that he wanted to know the truth before Sandra could arrange for him not to know it. He had not told Sandra he was doing this. This was the first decision he had made unilaterally in longer than he could clearly remember. The courier came to the door. He signed. He stood in the hallway under the chandelier that Sandra had bought at a Sotheby's auction 15 years ago and read the results page twice, and then a third time, and then he sat down on the bottom stair of the main staircase because his legs had made the decision before his mind had. Probability of paternity 99.97%. He sat on that stair for a long time. Sandra was in her study, making phone calls about the Pacific Bridge situation, her voice filtering through the closed door with a controlled urgency that he recognized as the sound she made when she was managing a crisis. He could hear her, but not the words. He didn't try to hear the words. He thought about the ultrasound at 20 weeks, the one he had attended with Nicole, where a technician had shown them the particular slope of a nose and the crossing of legs and the movement of a hand that was already distinctly a hand. He had held Nicole's hand during that appointment. He had held it with the full knowledge of what he had already set in motion. He thought about this for a long time, which was appropriate, because it was the kind of thing that should take a long time to think about. When Sandra came out of the study and found him on the stair and said, "Well," with the expectation of a woman who is waiting for information she has pre-decided the content of, he looked up at her and said, "He's mine, 99.97%. Sandra's face did the same thing it had done in the car, that brief arrest, that rapid internal recalibration. Then she bribed the lab. He looked at her for a moment that was completely quiet inside him. With what money, Mother? We gave her nothing. She left in sweatpants. I don't care how she did it. It doesn't change. He's my son. The words came out differently than any words he had produced recently. Not louder, actually quieter, which made them land harder. There was no qualification appended to them, no but or given that or I understand the situation, however. They were simply the words without scaffolding, and they meant exactly what they said. Sandra began the counter-argument retest court order litigation strategy, the Prescott timeline, the broader financial picture that required clarity about the heir situation, and Daniel listened to her build it the way he had listened to her build every argument she had ever made to him, with the specific quality of a person who has heard this construction before and knows its shape. He had always been a person who heard the argument and looked at its shape and found it persuasive, not because it was persuasive, but because arguing against Sandra required a musculature he had never developed. He was becoming aware, standing on the staircase of his mother's house at 8 in the evening, with the paternity test results in his hand, that the musculature might be developing now, slowly, under duress, the way muscles do develop, not in comfort, but in resistance. He did not argue with her. He went to his room and closed the door and sat in the dark for 2 hours doing the accounting of the last 3 months in the most honest terms he could manage, which were not flattering. Sandra's phone lit up at 10:18 with a banking notification. She had been waiting for it, the final confirmation of the garnishment reversal she had instructed Richard to pursue through their legal team, a long shot, but worth attempting. Instead, the notification read, Torres Capital Holdings, foreclosure notice, Whitmore Estate, Greenwich, CT. Notice, period 30 days, cure amount 38.4 million plus fees and penalties. She looked at it for a very long time. 38 million was not a number she could produce in 30 days. It was not a number she could produce at all. Not now. Not with the Prescott merger in its current state, and the Iron Gate debt sitting on top of the First National exposure, and every secondary lender in Portland having received through channels she did not yet understand some communication that had made them suddenly unavailable for her calls. The estate had been in the Anderson family for 4 generations. Her mother-in-law had been married in the garden. She had brought Daniel home from the hospital to that house. She had done every significant thing she could name within its walls, and the walls were now subject to a foreclosure notice signed by Nicole Torres. She put the phone face down on the desk and poured herself a scotch from the decanter on the sideboard, and stood at the window of her study, looking out at the dark grounds, and felt something she had not felt in 40 years of professional combat. She felt the specific cold of being outmaneuvered by someone she had underestimated. The engagement party for Daniel and Ashley Thomas had been planned for 3 weeks, the grand ballroom of the Benson Hotel in downtown Portland. 200 guests, a florist from Seattle who charged accordingly, and the particular social momentum of a public event that had been publicized enough that canceling it would require more explanation than proceeding with it. Sandra had decided to proceed. In her model of how the world worked, visible confidence was a form of currency, and she intended to spend it. She was wrong about this, but she did not yet know that. The evening of the party was warm for October, which Portland sometimes managed, and the Benson's ballroom on the 3rd floor was lit in the amber and ivory that the florist had specified. And by 8 o'clock the room held the concentrated wealth and social consequence of the Pacific Northwest's professional class. Venture capitalists from the Pearl District, developers from Lake Oswego, 2 sitting state senators, the managing partners of 3 law firms, and George White, who had come because declining would have required an explanation he was not ready to give while he was still evaluating whether the Whitmore deal was salvageable. Ashley was in ivory, Vera Wang working the room with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been raised to understand that parties were not social occasions, but professional ones wearing different clothes. Daniel stood beside her at the appropriate angle for photographs and moved when directed, and held his champagne with the grip of someone who needed something to hold. He had not been able to reach Nicole. Her previous phone number was disconnected. The apartment on Burnside, where they had lived together, was empty. He had driven there that afternoon and stood in the parking lot looking up at the dark windows for several minutes before driving away. He did not know where she was, which was a strange new condition for a man who had spent 2 years knowing exactly where she was, because she was, until recently, in whatever room he came home to. He stood in the grand ballroom of the Benson Hotel, holding his champagne, and he thought about the fact that his son existed in the world somewhere in this city, and he didn't know the address. This thought had a particular texture to it that was different from the other uncomfortable thoughts he had been having. It was not guilt exactly, though guilt was present. It was something more like the physical sensation of an absence, the awareness of something that should be in a specific location and is not the way you notice a sound when it stops, rather than when it's present. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected occurs, not all at once, but in a wave starting at the main entrance and spreading inward as heads turned and conversations lost their thread, and the ambient noise of 200 people dropped by half and then by half again. Nicole Torres came through the door of the grand ballroom of the Benson Hotel as though the room had been expecting her and had simply been waiting for her to arrive. She was wearing red, not the aggressive performance anxiety red of someone trying to make a statement, but the dark, assured red of someone who has decided that this is what she looks like now, and the decision is final. The dress was Rachel Roy, a designer whose work Nicole had worn at industry events in her former life, cut to fit her current body which was 3 days after delivering a child. Still the body of a woman who had been through something significant and had arrived at the other side of it, standing up. She wore no statement jewelry. She wore her mother's bangle. Kenneth walked on her left, impeccable, in a dark suit that cost more than it looked like it did, which was the point. Two men in well-fitted clothing came through the door behind them, the kind of men whose presence communicates a certain category of seriousness without being theatrical about it. She did not pause in the doorway. She walked into the center of the room at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the pace of someone moving through a space they are entirely comfortable in, and the crowd reorganized itself around her the way crowds do around a particular kind of gravity, not because they were compelled to, but because the geometry of the room had changed. Ashley reached her first. She had the momentum of a woman who had decided that the correct response to this situation was offense, and she deployed it. "You're crashing my party. Security!" Nicole turned her attention to Ashley with an unhurried completeness. "Hardly," her voice level and carrying without effort. "I own the venue." Ashley's momentum stuttered. "This is the Benson," which was acquired by Torres Hospitality Group last Tuesday as part of our Pacific Northwest portfolio expansion. Nicole looked around the ballroom with the unhurried assessment of someone taking inventory of something that belongs to them. "You've been celebrating your engagement in my living room, Ashley. I hope you enjoyed the floral arrangements. The florist is excellent." The ripple that moved through the room at this was not audible, but it was visible, the particular adjustment of posture and expression that happens when 200 people receive a piece of information simultaneously and begin revising their understanding of the situation they are in. George White moved through the crowd with the directness of a man who did not get where he was by standing still when things got interesting. He was 61, compact gray at the temples, with the specific intelligence of someone who had built Prescott Logistics from a regional trucking operation to a national infrastructure company through the ability to read situations faster than other people read them. He looked at Nicole and looked at Kenneth and looked at the quality of the moment and said, "You're with Torres Global, Kenneth. Correction, Mr. White. She is Torres Global. Nicole Torres, chairwoman and chief executive officer of Torres Global Industries." The sound of Sandra Anderson's champagne flute hitting the ballroom floor registered as a sharp, clean note in the sudden near silence. Not shattering, she had set it down too hard rather than dropping it, which was a distinction that said something about her even in that moment. She was standing 15 feet away, and she was looking at Nicole with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of them triumphant. Daniel was looking at Nicole from across the room. He had gone very still in the way that people go still when the world has reorganized itself so completely that movement seems inappropriate until the new shape is fully understood. He was not looking at a woman he had dismissed. He was looking at a stranger who happened to be wearing his wife's face and who had apparently, while living with him in a one-bedroom apartment and making pour-over coffee and building risk-scoring algorithms on her laptop at the kitchen table, been quietly in possession of a fortune that his family's entire debt could not approach. He started toward her. The crowd was still rearranging itself, and he moved through it without quite being aware of doing so. "Nicole." He said it quietly, the way you say the name of someone you've injured when you're close enough. That quiet is the only appropriate register. "I didn't know." She looked at him. The look was not unkind. It was something more difficult than unkind. It was the look of someone who has made a complete accounting and arrived at clarity. You knew enough, Daniel. You knew 3 months before Noah was born. You knew while you were holding my hand at the 20-week appointment. You made a choice every single day for 3 months to say nothing. That's not weakness. That's a decision. He held her gaze. He did not deny it. I stayed, she said, because I thought you would choose us. I waited for you to be the man I thought I had found. I was wrong about that. She paused, and what came next was not anger, but something colder and more final. But I was not wrong about Noah, and I will not be wrong about him. That's enough. She turned to George White, who had waited with the patience of a man who has learned that interrupting the important moments costs more than it gains. Mr. White, I understand you've been trying to reach our acquisitions team for several months regarding your logistics fleet. He nodded carefully. That's correct. We can have that conversation. However, I don't typically pursue partnerships with companies whose business relationships include entities with falsified financial disclosures. A pause measured. Whitmore Properties has been operating on misrepresented numbers for 3 years. Your due diligence team missed it. I'd suggest a conversation with your legal department before we discuss anything else. George White looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who has just recalculated an investment and does not like the new number. He excused himself, moving toward the exit with his phone already in his hand. The merger did not survive the ballroom. Ashley said something. Nicole had already moved on. Sandra came to her finally, or rather, arrived in her vicinity. Sandra Anderson did not go to people so much as redirect her trajectory to intersect with theirs. She looked at Nicole with the particular expression of someone who is processing the distance between who they thought they were dealing with and who they are actually dealing with, and finding the gap significant. You deceived us, Sandra said, not loudly. There were still people watching. Nicole regarded her with the measured attention of someone considering how much of the truth to offer. I didn't lie to you, Sandra. I told Daniel I didn't have family money. That's true, my parents are both gone. I told him I wanted a simple life. That was true. I wanted someone who wanted me, not what I owned. A step closer. You wanted money. You treated me like a liability because you thought I had none, and now you have my full attention. She held the older woman's gaze. I am considerably more expensive as an adversary than I ever was as a daughter-in-law. Sandra's expression cycled through several configurations before settling on something that looked like controlled fury. This isn't over. No, Nicole agreed. It isn't. She turned and moved back through the ballroom toward the exit, Kenneth at her shoulder, the 2 men falling in behind her. The crowd she passed through was different from the crowd she had walked into, quieter. Observing the ambient conversation, replaced by the specific silence of people who have witnessed something they will be describing to other people for some time. Before you understand what happened next in that ballroom, in the weeks that followed in the courtroom where Sandra made her last public stand, it's worth sitting with a question. Sandra Anderson spent 40 years building something real, a company, a family name, a legacy she believed in enough to do terrible things to protect. But somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing the difference between the legacy and the people who carried it. She started treating people like line items, useful or not useful, asset or liability. And when a person didn't fit the plan, she disposed of them. How many times have we watched someone do that? And how many times have we been close enough to say something and said nothing instead, Monday morning? Family Court of Multnomah County, Portland. The courtroom had the specific atmosphere of a room where difficult things are decided, the particular gravity of institutional furniture, and the weight of the state's authority pressing down through the fluorescent lights. Sandra had filed the emergency motion for custody over the weekend, working through Arthur Quinn, whose reputation in Oregon family law was built on his willingness to be aggressive in circumstances where aggression was the only available strategy. Nicole arrived with Stephanie Harris, who was 53 years old, a graduate of Columbia Law, and had argued and won custody cases in front of the Oregon Supreme Court on 3 separate occasions. She wore a charcoal suit and carried a leather briefcase, and had the bearing of someone who had been in this room many times and found it neither intimidating nor unfamiliar. Nicole had spent Sunday evening with Stephanie, working through the evidence package, deciding what to present and in what order. She had made every decision about strategy herself, with Stephanie providing legal architecture and Nicole providing direction. This distinction was important to her in a way she could not have fully explained, but which had something to do with the last 2 years of her life and the recovery of something she had misplaced. Judge Sandra Owens took the bench at 9:05. She was 61, with 22 years on the family court, which meant she had seen every configuration of human difficulty that family circumstances could produce and had developed in response. The specific quality of attention that comes from decades of distinguishing between what people said and what was actually true. Quinn opened. Nicole had no fixed address, had left the hospital against medical advice, had no current employment, was unstable and transient, and the Whitmore family, a prominent Portland institution, was prepared to offer the child a stable, resourced environment appropriate to a Thornton heir. He delivered this with the practiced energy of a man who had used versions of this argument before and found it effective. Stephanie's response was measured. Nicole had not left against medical advice. She had been evicted from her hospital room by Sandra Anderson, which was documented in the security logs she was submitting. Regarding fixed address, Nicole currently resided at the Torres family apartment at 104 Fifth Avenue, New York, a Torres Trust property since 1998, having been in Portland temporarily during a period of personal circumstances that had now resolved. Quinn, living in a hotel and then a family apartment, is hardly a demonstration of domestic stability. The Whitmore estate offers Judge Owens the Fifth Avenue Address Council. Are we talking about the building I'm thinking of? Stephanie placed a folder in front of the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. The deed, Your Honor, along with my client's financial affidavit, verified by the SEC and the IRS as of last quarter. Judge Owens opened the folder. She read the first page. She turned to the second. She looked up at Nicole. She looked back at the page. She looked at Quinn with an expression that had shifted significantly from the expression she had been wearing when she sat down. Mr. Quinn. Her voice had acquired a particular quality of quietness that was more authoritative than volume. Have you reviewed your client's financial documentation in this case, Quinn? I have, Your Honor. I believe the affidavit Ms. Harris has submitted is, this affidavit, Judge Owens said, is verified by 2 federal agencies and indicates that your opposing counsel's client has a net worth in the billions. A pause. Mr. Quinn, are you asking this court to find that a billionaire is financially unfit to care for her own child? The silence in the courtroom had a texture to it. Quinn looked at his notes. He looked at Sandra, who was seated directly behind Daniel at the plaintiff's table, and whose expression communicated the specific urgency of someone who needs their attorney to do something immediately. Quinn looked at Judge Owens. He did not have a good answer to the question she had asked because there was not a good answer to it. Judge Owens turned to Daniel. She looked at him with the direct attention of 22 years on the family court bench, which was the attention of someone who had learned to look at people rather than their lawyers when she needed to understand what was actually happening. Mr. Lopez, you're claiming an interest in the welfare of your son. You were present in the hospital room when your mother presented the separation agreement. In your own words, what has changed since that evening? Daniel looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, he was not looking at Sandra. He was looking at the judge. I know my son's name, he said. I know I was standing in the corner of that room. I know I should have stopped her. A pause. I didn't. That's all I can say about it. Judge Owens was quiet for a moment. That had weight to it. That's honest, she said. I'll give you that. She reviewed the full record for 11 minutes, during which the courtroom was very quiet. Then she delivered the ruling. Temporary sole legal and physical custody to Nicole Torres, pending full custody trial. Daniel Lopez, supervised visitation 4 hours weekly for the first 90 days, after which the supervision requirement would be reviewed. Sandra Anderson, no contact with the minor child until further order of the court, given the documented conduct at St. Augustine Medical Center and the evidence of the ongoing legal actions. Sandra stood. This court, 2 court security officers were already in motion. They were professional and unhurried about it, which made it worse. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of resistance that could be dignified. There was simply the redirection of a woman who had, in the space of 72 hours, lost her financing her family's estate, her son's upcoming marriage, and now the legal standing she had filed an emergency motion to acquire. She was guided toward the side door of the courtroom with the impersonal efficiency of an institution that had long since stopped being surprised by what people did when they were desperate. The door closed. Nicole walked out of the courtroom into the gray Portland morning with Stephanie at her right shoulder. At the top of the courthouse steps, she paused not for effect, but because she needed a moment, not of triumph, which was not what she felt, but of something harder to name. The particular stillness that follows a thing you knew was coming, and that arrived exactly as you expected, and was still when it came something you had to absorb. Daniel was standing to the left of the steps. He had come out through a different door. His hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at a point in the middle distance that was probably the parking structure across the street, or maybe nothing in particular. He looked like a man who had shed something, not cleanly, not without cost, but thoroughly. She stopped, not because she had planned to, but because the morning was quiet, and he was there, and there was something unfinished between them that wasn't going to resolve itself through avoidance. He looked at her. I'm going to be better, he said, not as a promise made to her. She understood that immediately, the way you understand the grammar of a sentence from its structure rather than its individual words. He was saying it to himself in her presence, which was a different thing, and in some ways a more honest one. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying several things, and chose none of them because they were all either too much or not enough. What she said was, 4 hours every Saturday. Don't be late. She walked down the steps toward the navigator where Kenneth was waiting. Behind her, Daniel Lopez stood on the courthouse steps in the gray morning light and did not move for a long time which was, Nicole suspected, the beginning of something. What it was the beginning of was not yet determined. That was, she had decided, his work to do, not hers. The week after the custody ruling had a particular quality of suspended tension, the way weather has a quality in the hours before a significant change. Not storm yet, not calm either, but something in between that the body registers before the mind catches up. Nicole felt it in the specific way that people who have spent their lives paying attention to systems feel it. The awareness that a situation has not yet resolved, that the apparent stillness is a phase and not a conclusion. She was back in New York, in the Torres apartment, and the days had organized themselves around Noah with the completeness that only newborns can impose on adult schedules. He was 10 days old now, and already different from the person he had been at 6 days, which was already different from the person he had been at 1 day, the change so rapid it was almost visible in real time, the slight filling out of his face, the increased focus of his attention. When she spoke, the way he had begun to turn his head toward her voice with the deliberateness of someone developing a preference. Carol managed the practical infrastructure of his care with the efficiency she brought to everything, but Nicole was present for most of it, in a way she had not anticipated, being drawn into the particular gravity of a small person who required her without apology. She worked during the hours he slept at the dining room table, with Kenneth's reports and her own laptop, and a coffee that was always slightly colder than she had intended by the time she got to it. The Torres Global quarterly numbers were strong. The company had run well in her absence, which was partly a testament to Kenneth's operational management, and partly a testament to the systems her father had built. Systems designed to function under leadership transitions, the legacy of a man who had always been planning for the contingency of not being there. She reviewed the reports and made decisions and sent responses and managed in the compressed way of someone with limited, uninterrupted hours the ongoing business of a company that did not pause because its chief executive had recently given birth in a hospital room while her in-laws attempted to dispose of her. She also, in the margins of these working hours, kept a careful eye on Sandra Anderson. Kenneth tracked this with his customary thoroughness. Sandra had gone quiet in the specific way that Nicole had identified in the Torres apartment the week before as the quiet of someone who had gone underground rather than gone still. She was not making the calls she had been making before the custody ruling. No more attempts to reach Meridian contacts, no more conversations with secondary lenders that Kenneth's network could monitor. She had closed her communication footprint, which meant she was either planning something or talking to someone she did not want tracked. Neither option was comfortable. Sandra's former personal assistant reached out to Daniel, Kenneth said one morning, appearing in the doorway of the dining room with his laptop at the angle he held it when he had something specific to report. Woman named Paula Reyes. She left Sandra's employ 6 months ago, not voluntarily. She contacted Daniel through his personal email with what she describes as information about Sandra's recent financial activities. Nicole set her coffee down. What kind of information? She's not specific in the email. She wants to meet in person. Kenneth paused. She also says she's afraid. The word landed in the room and sat there. Nicole thought about it for a moment, then set the meeting. Here, not there. And, Kenneth, if Paula Reyes is afraid, I want to understand specifically what of. Paula Reyes arrived at the Torres apartment at 2 o'clock the following afternoon, taking the service elevator as Nicole had arranged not to be clandestine, but because the main elevator required building staff to log visitors, and Paula had been specific about not wanting to be logged anywhere. She was 44, angular, with the look of someone who had been managing high-stress environments for long enough that the stress had become structural, built into the set of her jaw and the way she moved through a room as though she was calculating exits. She sat across from Nicole at the dining room table, and Carol brought water that Paula did not touch, and she laid out what she knew. In the 3 months before Noah's birth, while Sandra was negotiating the Prescott merger and managing the First National Capital situation and arranging the separation agreement, she had also entered into a borrowing arrangement with an entity called Cascadia Debt Partners. Paula had seen the documents, had in fact been asked to file them, which was why she had them. Because Paula Reyes was the kind of personal assistant who kept copies of everything, not because she anticipated needing them, but because 44 years of living had taught her that information was the only asset that didn't depreciate. Cascadia Debt Partners was not a licensed lending institution. It operated under a shell structure, registered in Delaware, with nominee directors and no public ownership disclosure, and the people who actually controlled it were connected through several layers of corporate distance to individuals whose primary business activities were not lending. The collateral Sandra had offered for the $4 million loan was a legal document, a guardianship assignment, a document purporting to establish Sandra Anderson as the legal guardian of the unborn child of Daniel Lopez and his wife in the event of a determination that the mother was unfit. The document bore the signatures of both Daniel and Nicole, authorizing the guardianship arrangement. Neither Daniel nor Nicole had signed it. Nicole sat with this information for the length of time it took her to fully understand its dimensions, which was approximately 8 seconds. The document was a fabrication. Sandra had forged both signatures on a legal instrument that purported to transfer guardianship rights over a child who had not yet been born. She had then used this fabricated instrument as collateral for a loan from an organization that was not legally authorized to lend in exchange for $4 million that had gone into Whitmore operating accounts during the quarter when the First National Capital situation was at its most acute. Cascadia had accepted the document as collateral because, for their purposes, what mattered was not the legal validity of the document, but its functional value, and its functional value was its ability to be used as leverage to obtain something. The something in this case was Noah. Cascadia had subsequently transferred the document, along with the associated loan rights, to a third party as part of a portfolio sale of distressed assets. This was standard practice in their business model. The third party now held as an asset on their books a document purporting to give Sandra Anderson guardianship over Nicole's son, and the mechanism for converting that asset into value was to help Sandra exercise the claimed rights. "They're not corporate people," Paula said the first time she had framed anything with that specific economy of language. The table between her and Nicole was very clean and very quiet. "They don't negotiate. They send people." Nicole looked at her for a moment. "When did the portfolio transfer happen?" 3 days ago. I only found out because I still have access to an email chain I shouldn't have access to. Sandra didn't realize I could still read it." Paula paused. "I contacted Daniel because I thought he should know, but then I realized you're the one who needs to know. You're the one who can actually do something about it." After Paula left, Nicole sat at the table for 60 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself before beginning to act. Then she stood and walked to the doorway of Noah's room and looked at him, 9 days old, sleeping on his back, with his arms thrown wide, in the particular abandon of someone who has not yet learned to protect himself from anything, who trusts completely that the environment around him is safe because it has been safe every time he has checked. The understanding of what the document meant if the third party acted on it was not abstract. It was this room, this person. She walked back to the table. "Kenneth, get Noah ready to travel. We're moving to the Greenwich estate tonight." A pause. "And call the FBI field office in Portland. Tell them we have information material to their ongoing investigation of Cascadia debt partners. They'll know the file." She looked at him with the directness that she had been using more consistently in the last 2 weeks, the directness of someone who had stopped filtering herself through the requirements of a persona she no longer needed. "They've been building that case for 8 months. We just gave them the piece that makes it prosecutable." Kenneth moved without comment, which was one of the things she valued most about him. She called Daniel herself. She had not spoken to him since the courthouse steps, and she did not enjoy making this call, but she made it because Noah's safety was not a category in which she permitted herself the luxury of avoidance. He answered on the second ring, and she told him what Paula had said. In the precise and sequential way she communicated information that mattered. He listened without interrupting, which was something she noted, because it was different from the way he had listened in the hospital room. Then he had been listening for an exit from the conversation, and now he was listening for the information itself. When she finished, the silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. "I'll come to Greenwich," he said. Not a question. She had intended to say no. She had the refusal prepared, reasonable and legally sound. The custody agreement specified supervised visitation on Saturdays, and this was Wednesday, and the arrangement was not for his comfort, but for Noah's consistency. These were correct reasons. She said, "Drive carefully. The service entrance on the east side. Carol will let you in." She did not examine this decision closely. She simply made it and moved on, which was the only way to make decisions under the specific pressure of the next 24 hours. The Torres estate in Greenwich, Connecticut had been in the family since Nicole's father purchased it in the mid-90s, during the period when he had enough money to want something that could be a home rather than an investment, and had chosen this particular house because it had a kitchen large enough to cook in properly and a garden that would be in the right season, the kind of garden that reminded him of why he had worked as hard as he had. The house was not a mansion in the way that the Whitmore estate was a mansion. It was not about imposing scale or dynastic statement. It was large enough to be comfortable and no larger, with the quality of a place that had been genuinely lived in by people who had found it habitable. By 9 o'clock that evening, Kenneth had arranged the security detail, 4 people exterior and interior, with a rotation that covered every entry point, including the service access that Sandra would know about from any research she had done on the property. Carol had Noah settled in the room she had designated as the nursery on the second floor, with a monitor running and the particular arrangement of objects that Noah had already begun to associate with the routine of sleep. Daniel arrived at 10:15, and Carol let him in, as Nicole had said, and he came upstairs without being asked to, and stood in the doorway of the nursery and looked at his son for the longest uninterrupted time he had yet had access to 6 or 7 minutes in which he said nothing, and Noah slept, and the monitor tracked the gentle rhythm of small lungs working. Nicole watched this from the hallway. She did not announce herself. She watched him watch his son, and she thought about the 20-week ultrasound which she had thought about many times in the last 2 weeks, and which she suspected she would continue to think about for a long time, not with the specific grief of betrayal, which had its own shelf life, but with the more durable question of how she had read that room, how she had looked at a man standing beside her at a hospital ultrasound machine and believed what she saw. She was not in the habit of being wrong about people, and being wrong about Daniel had not made her distrust her judgment generally, so much as it had made her more careful about the specific question of what people showed you when they were comfortable versus what they did when they were asked to choose. He had answered that question definitively and repeatedly in the wrong direction. But he was also standing in the doorway of his son's room at 10:15 on a Wednesday night, and he had driven here without being asked twice, and the expression on his face had nothing performed about it. She went to the kitchen and made tea. He found her there at 10:40. They sat at the kitchen table with cups between them and the specific awkward honesty of a shared space between people who have lost the configuration they used to occupy together and haven't yet settled into any new one. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. Not because he had decided to be useful. She suspected he had decided that much earlier in some private recalibration she hadn't been present for, but because he was ready to ask the question out loud, which was a different kind of decision. She told him, if anything happened tonight, if anyone attempted to access the house, if any situation developed that required a physical presence between Noah's room and whatever was coming, she needed another adult who had legal standing as the child's parent. Kenneth could handle coordination and communication. She would handle strategy, but she needed someone who could stand in front of a door and mean it. He nodded. He did not ask whether she trusted him to do this. That question was answered by the fact of his being here, and they both understood that. She went to her room at midnight and slept for 3 hours, which was the amount she allowed herself, and she slept without the particular difficulty she had expected, because she was genuinely tired in the cellular way that follows weeks of sustained high-stakes operation, and her body insisted on its minimum. She was awake at 3 at the dining room table with coffee when Kenneth appeared at 3:12 with the look of someone who has received information that requires immediate processing. Building security just flagged an anomaly on the east side perimeter. The exterior camera on the service entrance went dark at 3:08. Manual interference, someone covered the lens. The interior of Nicole Torres in the 3 seconds following this information was not chaotic. It was the opposite, the specific compression of attention that happens when the thing you have been preparing for begins. Every unnecessary thought went quiet. What remained was operational. Wake the detail. All 4 positions active. Daniel stays on the second floor in front of Noah's door. Kenneth, you're with me. She was dressed in 60 seconds. She moved through the house in the particular way of someone who has walked the same space enough times to do it without light, arriving at the ground floor entry hall as the interior lights on a separate circuit from the main panel, as Kenneth had arranged, cut out completely. In the dark, the house was not unfamiliar. She had grown up in spaces like this in the specific way that people who have spent their lives managing assets develop a relationship with buildings. She knew its dimensions and its sound qualities and the location of every doorway without needing to see them. The service elevator on the east wing activated. The override code, a 7-digit sequence that only a small number of people had ever known, was being used. Sandra had obtained it years ago during a period when she had been cultivating the Anderson-Torres relationship in the days before Nicole's identity was concealed, when Sandra had believed that the Torres connection might be professionally useful. She had kept it. Nicole had not thought to change it because She had not anticipated that Sandra, who had so recently lost every institutional resource available to her, would be the one using it. This was the one mistake Nicole had made, and she filed it without drama. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened, and Sandra Anderson came out of it. She was not the Sandra of the Benson Hotel ballroom, or the courtroom, or even the hospital room. The woman who emerged from the service elevator at 3:19 in the morning of the Torres estate in Greenwich was a woman from whom all of the architecture had been removed. No Chanel, no pearls, no curated blankness. She wore a dark coat over clothes that did not match, and her hair, which had always been precise, was not. She had with her two men who were not the kind of men you hired through normal channels, large and quiet, in the way of people for whom quiet is a professional quality, and behind her a slight nervous individual who was not a man hired for physical presence, but for legal cover, holding a manila folder, and the expression of someone who understood that he was in a situation that had exceeded his professional risk tolerance, but had not yet found the moment to say so. She also had a document, the guardianship assignment, the fabricated one with the forged signatures. She was holding it as though it were a boarding pass, the thing that authorized her to be somewhere. Kenneth's voice came from the hallway to her left, carrying without effort, FBI Portland Field Office is on the line, Mrs. Anderson. Connecticut Field Office has units 2 minutes out. Cascadia Debt Partners has been under the federal investigation for 14 months. You just walked into the middle of a prosecution that's been waiting for exactly this kind of documented action. The two large men looked at each other. The nervous man with the folder had stopped moving. Sandra looked at Kenneth. She looked at the hallway. She looked at Nicole, who was standing at the end of the entrance hall with the particular quality of someone who has arranged this room and knows where everything in it is and is not afraid of any of it. "I built everything," Sandra said. The statement came out with the bewilderment of someone who had intended to say something else and found that this was what came out instead. Her voice in the dark of the entry hall was different from her daytime voice, stripped of its professional authority, operating closer to something underneath. "Everything we had, everything Daniel has, I built it." "I know," Nicole said. She did not say it unkindly. "And you just—" Sandra stopped. She looked at the document in her hand, and then at the hallway, and then at the space between where she was standing and where she needed to be for any version of this to go the way she had planned it. The space was not navigable. She could see that now, which was several hours after she should have seen it, but she was seeing it. Daniel came down the stairs. He had been on the second floor as Nicole had asked, and he had heard the elevator and stayed where he was, in front of Noah's door, as agreed. But then he had made the same kind of unilateral decision that he had been making with increasing frequency in the last 2 weeks, the decision to move without checking with anyone whether moving was permitted, and he had come down. He stood on the third step from the bottom, looking at his mother across the entry hall. She looked at him. What moved across her face in that moment was complicated, in the way that things are complicated when they involve 40 years of a particular relationship between a parent and a child, the specific grief of a woman who had done everything for a specific reason, and who was standing in the wreckage of the reason, and who could not yet fully process the distance between what she had intended and what she had produced. "Mom," Daniel said. One word. It was not an appeal. It was not an accusation. It was the sound of a person acknowledging the person in front of them in full, seeing them completely past the document and the forged signatures and the men in dark coats and the 40 years of a particular kind of love that had never quite learned to hold people without gripping them. It was also a refusal. Everything it refused was in the register of his voice. One of the large men, reading the situation with the professional efficiency of someone who calibrates risk for a living, took a step back toward the elevator. The second man took a step to his right, increasing his distance from Sandra. The nervous man with the folder set it on the hall table very quietly and did not pick it up again. Sandra looked at Daniel on the stair. The document in her hand had the stillness of something that has already lost its function. The red and blue of law enforcement lighting began to come through the transom windows above the front door, first one unit, then a second, then the particular visual language of a situation being formally contained. Sandra set the document on the floor, not thrown, not crumpled. She placed it with the specificity of someone putting down something she has been carrying for a long time, something whose weight she is finally done with. She did not speak again. When the Connecticut field office agents came through the front door 40 seconds later, 4 of them with the FBI Portland supervisor on Kenneth's phone, providing coordination, she went with them without the kind of resistance that would have required force, which was the last dignified thing she did. The 2 large men were detained in the east hallway. The nervous man with the folder, whose name was it, developed an associate at a Portland law firm who had been told he was reviewing a legitimate guardianship filing and had decided too late that he had been told a convenient, incomplete version of the truth, provided a voluntary statement within the hour, and was released pending further review. Daniel remained on the 3rd stair until the front door closed, and then he sat down on it and put his face in his hands, not in the way of someone performing emotion, but in the way of someone who needs a moment in which the structure of their face is not available for public interpretation. Nicole stood in the entry hall for a moment. Then she went up to Noah's room and stood in the doorway the same way Daniel had stood in it 4 hours earlier, and listened to the monitor's evidence of steady breathing, and felt the specific quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the sustained maintenance of vigilance over an extended period. She thought, it's over now. Then more precisely, this part is over. There is a difference, and she had learned enough in the last 2 weeks to insist on it. The federal proceedings moved with the efficiency that federal proceedings sometimes achieve when the evidence is clear and the defendant's resources are exhausted. Sandra Anderson faced 4 counts: fabrication of legal documents, conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy with an unlicensed financial entity, and her remaining legal team, working with the reduced budget of a woman whose company had been acquired and whose estate was in foreclosure, negotiated a plea arrangement over the course of 6 weeks that Sandra signed in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland on a gray November morning. The terms: a suspended sentence with 5 years of supervised probation conditioned on her departure from Portland and Oregon, her permanent relinquishment of any claim or legal interest related to Noah, and a financial settlement that was nominal because there was nothing financial left to settle. Nicole was not in the room when Sandra signed. She did not need to be. She had sent Stephanie Harris to observe and to ensure that every term was precisely as negotiated, and Stephanie had confirmed this in a text message that arrived while Nicole was at the dining room table in the Torres apartment, eating breakfast with Noah in the bouncy seat beside her. Him focused on the ceiling fan, which had recently become interesting to him, her focused on a market analysis that required her attention. The Whitmore estate in Greenwich, which had been in Sandra's family for 4 generations, site of weddings and christenings and 40 years of holiday gatherings and the specific ordinary weight of a family's accumulated time was formally transferred to Torres Capital Holdings at the conclusion of the foreclosure process. Nicole's instruction to Kenneth regarding the property had been specific. She did not want it as a residence. She wanted it as the Northeast campus of the Torres Family Foundation, a philanthropic entity her father had established, and she had continued focused on economic access for single-parent families and first-generation entrepreneurs. The renovation took 4 months. The gate at the entrance of the property, through which Sandra had driven her car 10,000 times over 40 years, was fitted with a brushed bronze plaque, Torres Family Foundation, Northeast Campus. Beneath it, in smaller text, the foundation's mission statement, which Harrison Torres had written himself and which Nicole had never altered, to give people the tools they already deserve. She did not stage a moment at the gate. She did not take a photograph. She drove past it one morning in early spring on her way to a foundation board meeting, and she looked at it through the car window for the length of time it took to pass it, and she felt not triumph, which had never been the point, and not satisfaction exactly, which implied an ending. She wasn't sure this was something closer to completion. The feeling of a circle that has closed, not because someone won, but because what needed to happen had happened, and the world had reorganized itself accordingly, and it was possible now to turn and face the direction that came next. Daniel Lopez moved to Bend, Oregon in December. He had not discussed this decision with anyone before making it. He had simply, in the way he was learning to do things, decided and then acted. He took a job as a project coordinator with a construction company that did commercial build-outs across Central Oregon, work that was structural in the literal sense, involving measurements and materials, and the particular problem-solving of making things that needed to last. His apartment was small. His hands, which had always been the hands of someone who managed other people's physical work rather than doing it himself, became the other kind of hands calloused in specific places, capable of things they had not previously been capable of. He drove to Portland every Saturday. The custody arrangement had evolved by the time Noah was 4 months old from supervised visitation to unsupervised, not because Nicole had decided to trust him exactly, but because the evidence of the Saturdays was consistent, and Nicole had always been someone who followed evidence. He was on time. He was present in the room with Noah rather than adjacent to it. He had learned with the focused attention of someone who understands they are being evaluated on an unfamiliar rubric what Noah's different sounds meant and what he needed when he made them. Nicole did not join these visits. She arranged the apartment, the Torres apartment, which had become their primary residence, so that Daniel had access to a specific room and Carol was available if anything was needed. And she was elsewhere. Not because she couldn't be in the same space as him, but because the Saturdays were his, and she understood the difference between tolerating something and actually giving it. Spring came into New York the way spring always came, not cleanly, not all at once, but in a negotiation between the previous season and the one arriving with days that belonged to each alternating, until the new one simply had more days, and the argument was effectively over. Nicole was in the garden of the Torres estate in Greenwich on one of the first genuinely warm Saturdays of the year. The foundation board meeting had run long, and she had stayed afterward to walk the grounds with the landscape architect who was redesigning the West Garden, and by the time the meeting ended, the afternoon had the quality that spring afternoons have when the light comes from a new angle and everything is slightly more visible than it was the week before. Noah was in the garden too. He had been mobile for 3 weeks, which in practice meant that he moved in the specific random direction way of someone who has discovered locomotion and has not yet developed any particular agenda about where to apply it. He was in the grass near the stone bench where Carol was sitting, conducting what appeared to be a thorough investigation of the properties of a particular section of the lawn, moving from the grass to a flower bed, to a stone, and back to the grass, with the focused attention of a researcher who has not yet been told that any of these things are less interesting than any other thing. Kenneth appeared on the terrace with a folder, as Kenneth always appeared, and sat in the chair beside Nicole's. "The quarterly reports are ready. Good numbers across all divisions." He set the folder down. "And this came this morning." He placed an envelope beside the folder. Nicole recognized Daniel's handwriting on the outside, specific, the handwriting of someone who had learned to print clearly in the service of practical precision. She opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written in the same deliberate printing. "Nicole, I am not writing to ask for anything, and I'm not writing to offer anything except what I can actually deliver, which is an accounting. I know what I did. I knew it at 20 weeks, and I knew it in the hospital room, and I knew it on the courthouse steps, and knowing it and doing the other thing anyway is not something I've found a way to rationalize into something more comfortable than what it was. I'm not trying to. What I'm trying to do instead is build the kind of record that would eventually be worth reading. Not to you, I understand that's not the frame. For Noah. So that if he ever asks me what I did when things were difficult, I have an answer that I can say without looking at the floor. Last Saturday, he grabbed my thumb and wouldn't let go for the better part of an hour. I don't deserve to feel what I felt about that. I felt it anyway. I'm learning, Nicole. It's slow. It should be. D. She read it through twice. The second time, more slowly than the first, the way you read something when you're looking for the thing underneath the words, the diagnostic reading of someone who has been trained since childhood to look at what's actually being said versus what's being performed. What she found was not a performance. It was the careful, precise accounting of a man who had decided to be accurate about himself, which was a harder thing than being flattering and a rarer thing than being defensive. She folded it. She set it on the table. "Should I prepare a response?" Kenneth asked. She watched Noah in the grass. He had found a dandelion and was examining it with the concentration of a jeweler, the yellow of it absurdly bright against the green. He looked up, located her by some combination of sound and instinct, and did with his face the thing that faces do when they find the specific person they were looking for. "Not yet," Nicole said. "Let him keep building. We'll see." Noah made a sound, not a word, not yet, but the sound of someone practicing the architecture of communication, getting the mouth and the breath organized around something that would eventually be language. He had been making these sounds for a week, and they were to Nicole the most interesting thing she had heard in a long time. She thought about her father, in the way she often thought about him when Noah did something new, not with the grief that the first year had been characterized by, but with the specific quality of someone who has learned to carry an absence alongside the present rather than instead of it. Harrison Torres had been a man who believed that the most useful thing you could build was something that continued to function when you were no longer there to operate it. He had built a company on this principle. He had tried to build a daughter on it too, with varying success, and the variance was something Nicole had come to understand was not his fault and not hers either, was simply the nature of the project, which was ongoing and would not be completed in any single lifetime. She thought about what the last 3 months had built. Not the obvious things, the legal outcomes, the financial reorganization of the Whitmore properties, the foundation campus, the custody arrangement. Those were consequences which was a different category from the thing that had actually been built. What had actually been built was harder to inventory. Something about the difference between the person who had signed a separation agreement in a hospital bed at midnight and the person sitting in this garden now. Not that the first person had been weak, she had not been weak, but that she had been living inside a set of assumptions about what her life was supposed to contain, and those assumptions had been wrong, and the process of the last 3 months had been the process of replacing wrong assumptions with accurate ones. The accurate ones were not more comfortable. They were simply true, which was a different quality, and one that Nicole had always preferred when she could achieve it. Noah had abandoned the dandelion and was making his way toward her across the grass, with the particular determination of someone who has decided on a destination and is allocating everything to getting there. He fell twice the second time, with more emphasis than the first, and both times he sat for a moment in the considering way he had developed, not crying, just evaluating, and then got back up and resumed the project. Carol watched him from the bench with the expression she wore when she was trying not to interfere with something she could see was resolving itself. He made it to the leg of Nicole's chair. He put both hands on her knee and looked up at her with the specific directness that he had been developing over the last several weeks, the directness of someone who has located the person who is most important to him and has no interest in pretending otherwise. She picked him up. He was heavier than he had been at the beginning, denser, with becoming the weight of someone who had been doing the fundamental work of growth in every moment for 5 months. He grabbed her collar with one hand and the end of her hair with the other and looked at her face with the focused attention he had recently developed for faces. She thought about what she had told him in the dark of the hospital room on the night of his birth, that he would never know what that room felt like, that she would make sure the people who put them there couldn't reach them. He would not know. That was true and remained true. The world he was growing into had the Torres apartment and the Greenwich garden, and Carol making sounds of encouragement from the stone bench, and Saturdays with his father in Portland, and the specific shape of Nicole's face when she looked at him, which was a shape she had not fully controlled since the moment they put him in her arms, and which she had stopped trying to control because some expressions are not available for management. The thing he would not know, the hospital room, the separation agreement, the envelope on the bed, was not a secret she was keeping from him. It was simply the past, which exists in a different category from the present and does not require that every person it affected carry it visibly at all times. There were things he would know when he was old enough to know things, that his mother had been someone before she was his mother and had made choices about that person that she did not regret, that his grandfather had built something worth inheriting, not because it was large, but because it was honest, that the people who underestimate you are not always wrong about everything, but they are always wrong about the thing that matters most, which is what you are capable of when the situation requires it. He would know, because she would tell him that being thrown away and building something from the ground up afterward are not opposite experiences, that the second one often requires the first. Not because hardship is instructive in any simple way, but because the clarity that arrives when someone shows you exactly who they are and you stop pretending otherwise, is a kind of foundation that cannot be purchased or inherited. It has to be earned the hard way in rooms with fluorescent lights at midnight, with the sound of a monitor tracking a heartbeat that you have decided with complete finality to protect. Noah let go of her hair and patted her collar instead, which was new, a developmental achievement she was cataloging as she cataloged everything, because the rate of change was astonishing and she did not want to miss it. Kenneth, who had been reviewing the quarterly folder with the self-sufficiency of someone comfortable with being present without demanding attention, looked up. The Torres Foundation Northeast Campus renovation is on schedule for the July opening. He paused. Will you be there? She thought about the gate, the plaque, the garden that had been Sandra Anderson's garden, and was now something else, not revenge, not a monument to anything, but a place where something useful happened for people who needed it. Yes, she said, I'll be there. Now, before this story closes, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it rather than just answer. Daniel Lopez chose his son. He chose late. He chose after every wrong decision had been made and every damage had been done, and the choosing cost him nothing anymore except the ongoing work of showing up. Is that enough? Can a person earn their way back from that specific kind of failure? Not dramatic cruelty, not malice. Just the repeated choice of the easier thing until the easier thing became catastrophic. Or is there a point at which late is simply late? And Sandra Anderson, she had real reasons. The company she had built, the name she had protected, the specific terror of watching something you constructed with 40 years of your life come apart at the seams. Does having real reasons change anything about what she did with them? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that the comments on these stories are the reason I keep making them, because you bring things to these questions that I haven't thought of, and the conversation is better than the story ever is alone. If something in Nicole's story landed for you, if you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you and decided you weren't worth seeing, share this with someone who would understand why. Some stories are most useful when they find the right person at the right time. Noah was watching the ceiling fan again. It had followed them from the apartment in its portable form, a small battery-operated version that Carol had packed because she understood what it was for, and it turned above the patio table with its consistent gentle revolution, doing what it had always done. He pointed at it. Then he looked at Nicole to confirm that she had seen what he was pointing at. She had seen it. She had seen all of it.